March 13th, 1964, New York City, 3 a.m. Kitty Genovese is locking up her red Fiat and walking to her home in Kew Gardens, Queens, New York. She's attacked, stabbed, and murdered. While this young independent woman screams for help under the street lamp, she's heard. She's even seen by two men, but no one came to her rescue. 58 years later, Kitty's family and plenty of others are still wondering how it could happen and what it says about how we see ourselves and how we really perform under pressure. This is the story of Kitty Genovese, the victim, the killer, and the bystanders. Hey y'all, I'm Chris Calvert.
And I'm her husband, Rob Pottorff. This is Scotty. Welcome to Hitched to Homicide.
For better or worse.
Till death do us part.
Welcome back, everybody.
Yes, welcome. And for our Hebrew-speaking friends.
Yes.
Baruch haba, Baruch haba, Baruch haba.
Very nice.
And I hope that was correct.
And for our dog friends like Scotty,
Yeah.
woof, woof, woof,
Woof, woof, woof, woof.
He was barking his head off before we started this.
Oh, my gosh.
Before we even started to record. Ugh.
He's a handful at times.
He is.
Man.
Well, wherever you're listening, be sure to like, rate, and review and
Yes.
subscribe. You
Yep.
can also join the In-Laws and Outlaws. That's our closed Facebook group. All you got to do is go in there and answer a couple questions and you're in.
Easy question.
And you can also watch us on YouTube now.
Yeah.
We're having a lot of fun. Thank you to all our new subscribers there. And welcome to all the new people who are in our family of
Yes.
the In-Laws and Outlaws.
Yes.
So we're glad that you're there.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to start right in on this case today. This is really amazing, and I actually watched a documentary. I'm going to talk a little bit about it at the end, but that's why I wanted to do this case, was because of the documentary that I watched. I'd never heard of this case before,
Yeah.
surprisingly. It is pretty old.
Okay.
It's older than me, which is ancient. So, yeah.
Well, if that's the case, then I'm really ancient.
It's older. It's not as old as you are, honey, but it's older than me.
Okay.
I'm just saying. Before we get started, let me thank some sources: the New York Daily News, the Queens Chronicle, the LA Times, the Guardian, Newsday, the New York Post, NPR, History.com, Murderpedia, the book Kitty Genovese, The Murder, the Bystanders, and the Crime That Changed America by Kevin Cook, and the documentary The Witness, the true story of Kitty Genovese.
All right. Well, you ready?
I am.
All right, let's do it.
Catherine Susan Genovese, she goes by Kitty, was the oldest child of Vincent and Rachel Giordano Genovese. Her father ran a coat and apron supply company that specialized in aprons for restaurants, and her mother stayed at home to raise the kids. She grew up in a fourth-floor, four-family row house in Brooklyn's Prospect Park.
Okay.
She's the oldest of five children: Vincent, Susan, William, and Francis.
Okay.
Kitty was funny. She was very popular in school. She was a ringleader among her girlfriends, not in a bad way, just
Right.
like a natural-born leader.
They were just good girlfriends.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one of her best friends, Ilsa, said that she would imitate her teachers, and she really liked to imitate her French teacher doing the Sid Caesar routine where you speak nonsense, but you do it with a French accent. This is something Rob does. Yes, exactly. He does it to the dog
Yeah.
all the time.
Here, let's try it. He's staring at me.
She attended and graduated from the all-girl Prospect Heights High School. Now, everyone in every stage of her short life will say the same things about Kitty. She's spunky. She's fun. She's also tiny. She's got a little short haircut. And Kitty's 5'1" and weighs 100 pounds or
wow.
less.
Wow.
Soaking wet.
She's tiny.
Yeah. She actually won the senior superlative of her class cut up.
Okay.
So did you win any superlatives, Rob, when you graduated high school?
I don't think I won any superlatives. I did write our senior song, our class song, and then I sang it at graduation, and I got to turn the tassel to the other side.
That tracks.
Yeah.
Mr. Songwriter. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I got most likely to go bald, which didn't happen, but it was because I had Marsha Brady hair. It was all the way down to my butt.
Marsha.
Yes. And also got most talented.
Oh,
so that was good. I liked that one.
Because you were a dancer.
I was. And I have the arthritis to prove it.
Yeah.
When Kitty graduates, moving on.
Yep.
When Kitty graduates in June of 1953, her parents decide that the city is getting too dangerous to raise a family. Her mom actually witnesses a murder on the street.
Oh, wow.
And they pack up and move to New Canaan, Connecticut, which is about 50 miles north of the city.
Okay.
But Kitty didn't want to go to the burbs. She wanted to stay in the city. And she tells her parents, I'm going to find a job. I'll find a job in a safe neighborhood. And I'll stay in touch with everybody. And I'll come to Connecticut on the weekends. I'll take the train on the weekends just to check in.
Come out to the coast.
So
it'll be fun.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's what I thought of the minute you started saying it.
Yeah. She's going to do all these things.
Okay.
So she really made her case for why she wanted to stay in the city was what I was referring to. And at first, she stayed with her grandfather, and she worked for an insurance company as a secretary.
Okay.
Now, by 1954, she was earning enough to rent her own place. And along the way, Kitty's going to work as a secretary, a waitress, a hostess in an Italian restaurant.
Wow.
And she started tending bar. And I read where she liked those bar tips because they were tax-free.
Of course.
You go, Kitty.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Now, she finally settles in Queens, where she falls in love with a guy named Rocco, and they get married.
Okay.
But it didn't last long. And there's really just not a whole lot about this marriage. I don't even think it lasted a year.
Oh, wow.
In 1963, Kitty meets Mary Ann Zelenko. They meet at a place called the Swing Rendezvous, which was an underground club at 117 McDougal. That's in the Village.
Okay.
It's a great place. Now, Kitty asks Mary Ann if she knows her from somewhere, because this is a pickup line. Something Kitty's family doesn't know about her until she's gone is that she's gay.
Huh.
And these two fall in love. Kitty was 27, Mary Ann was 24.
Okay.
Now, by this time, Kitty's managing a bar in Queens, and these two look for an apartment together, and they find a one-bedroom on Austin Street in Kew Gardens, right next to the Long Island Railroad Station.
Okay.
Next door was the Austin Bookshop, and on the southeast end, opposite their apartment building, was a drugstore and a pub that was open most nights until 4 a.m. Now, this was one of the better neighborhoods, and people apparently in 1963 in Queens, they didn't even lock their doors.
Really?
Yeah, very family friendly.
Wow.
And I think Queens is still very family friendly today.
Yeah.
Kitty tended bar at Eve's 11th Hour, which was a neighborhood bar on Jamaica Boulevard in Hollis, Queens. Queens has all kinds of different neighborhoods. So it'll be like Hollis, Queens, Kew Gardens,
Right.
Queens, right?
Right.
So she was really good at tending bar, and she quickly became the manager. And the owner was gone all the time. So she stepped into that role.
Right.
But she did a lot of double shifts, and she would work 12 and 15-hour days. And she would work late with the closing bartender and not drive home sometimes until after 3 in the morning. And it was a short 10-minute drive from the bar to her apartment in Kew Gardens. And she would park her little red convertible Fiat at the Long Island Railroad Station because the cops didn't give tickets in that lot.
No.
You know, there was a no parking sign, but everybody parked there.
Right.
That's not New York City today. They love to give parking tickets in New York City today. I think there's a whole Instagram account dedicated to the parking tickets.
It's a sport.
It really is. Kitty had made some friends with some of the other tenants, including a woman named Sophia Farrar, who would go into Kitty and Mary Ann's apartment if she heard their phone ringing, and she'd answer the phone and take a message for the girls.
What?
Yeah. So, I mean, these apartments are really close together.
Okay.
She would, they don't lock their doors.
Yeah.
And Sophie would hear the phone ring, so she'd go in and answer and take a message for the girls.
That's okay. That's weird.
I mean, it is, if you think about it, but it's 1963, 1964.
True. It's the age of flower power and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think they trusted the people who lived in the building.
Of course.
Now, Kitty would sometimes stay up. After she would get in at 3 or 4 in the morning, she'd stay up and have coffee with Sophie in the morning before Sophie's kids went off to school. It was a really friendly neighborhood, and Kitty and Marianne liked living there. And I read in one source that Kitty was managing the bar and saving money because she wanted to open her own Italian restaurant.
Oh, nice. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, there is one account of Miss Kitty getting arrested.
Okay.
It's while she's working at the bar, she's taking bets and passing them along to a bookie.
Oh, wow.
And one day, an undercover policeman came in to another bar. His name is Walter Newman, Wally, as Kitty knew him to be. And he wanted to place a $4 bet on a daily double entry at a horse track.
Okay.
Now, Dee, who's at the other bar with the undercover cop, she calls Kitty with the bet. She gives her the bet, which Kitty will then pass on to the real bookie.
Right.
But 2 hours after Kitty takes this call and this bet, Officer Newman shows up and arrests Kitty. But she gets caught and fined $50.
What about the bookie?
I mean, I don't know what happened to him.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know what happened to him.
She's just passing along the information, but she got busted?
She got busted.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And taken in and arrested. She was booked. There's a mugshot of her, and she's fined $50.
Wow.
And the interesting thing is her mugshot is the most famous photo of Kitty.
Really?
And she's a beautiful girl, but it's her mugshot. That's the one that everybody used. Now, other than this, Kitty is living her life in the city and enjoying every minute of it, according to those who knew her or worked with her. And she was this tiny little ray of sunshine.
Okay.
Now, Winston Moseley is born on March 2nd, 1935, to parents Alfonso and Fanny. He's an only child, and he grows up in Harlem on West 145th Street. And according to his mother, he was a bright child. When Winston was 9 years old, his mother told him that she had to go to the hospital to have a tumor removed, a cancer from her stomach.
Wow.
Not that she was pregnant, but that she had to have a cancer removed from her stomach.
Okay.
And she did go to the hospital, but she did not come back.
Really?
Fanny fled to her hometown in Michigan. She wanted away from her husband.
And she ditched the kid.
Ditched him.
Wow.
Now, Winston's father could not raise him by himself, so he shipped him off to Holly, Michigan to live with Fanny's mother. And growing up, he wanted to be a scientist or work for the FBI.
Wow.
And when Winston is 10, his father moves to Detroit and sends for him, and these two move in together. But his father tells him that he wants to be honest with him. So he explains to Winston, who is still 10 years old, that he is not his real father.
Oh, no.
That his mother had been with another man.
Wow.
Yeah.
To a 10-year-old.
To a 10-year-old.
Nice.
At the age of 16, Winston loses his virginity to one of his aunts, who is married.
Wow.
Then in 1953, he meets Pauline Cisco. Winston is 19, Pauline is 17. These two marry in 1955 and move to Brooklyn and into a studio apartment over a bar, which was great until Pauline started sleeping with the bartender.
Man.
And Winston then went out and bought a gun and threatened to kill the bartender. He filed for divorce 2 years after they married in 1957. Now, after this, Winston follows his dad to Queens. His father had opened a TV and radio repair shop.
Okay.
I read that, and I can remember when the TV repairman came to the house. Now, when was the last time? Do people get TVs repaired anymore? Or do they just chuck them and go buy a new one at Costco?
No, they're too expensive to even repair. And they're so cheap anymore.
Yeah, it's like the printer. You buy the printer, which isn't expensive, but the ink for the printer is
more expensive than the printer
itself. Yeah. But his dad, he worked on small appliances and TVs.
Okay.
Now, Winston was a smart guy. He had an IQ of 135.
Wow.
He took a job at a place called Ray Graham, which was a business machine company where he punched data cards for the company's first-generation computer. Now, we've talked about this before. If you've ever seen those punch cards, they're pretty interesting to look at, but those had to be hand-fed into this computer. And now we just have an iPhone, or you just have an Android, or whatever.
Yep.
And you've got all that technology in your back pocket, which
Yep.
is pretty scary.
Yep.
In 1961, Winston married Elizabeth Grant. She goes by Betty. She's a registered nurse who he met in a record store. And these two would go on to have 2 boys. Mark is their biological son, and Carrie is a boy that they will adopt. They lived in a home that they bought on Sutter Avenue in South Ozone Park. Now, the Mosleys paid their taxes. They kept their yard looking good. They went to Coney Island and Rockaway Beach. They did all the things that Queens families or New York families did.
Sure.
They owned 5 purebred German Shepherds.
Wow.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of dog.
Well, and German Shepherds are big.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's a lot of dog.
Yeah. He had one that was his favorite, and his name was Wolfie. And Wolfie slept under Winston and Betty's bed at night. And speaking of bed, when Betty and Winston get married, they have a normal sex life.
Okay.
But as time goes on, Winston never wanted to have sex with his wife. He had a hard time getting aroused. He didn't want his wife to see him without his clothes on. He started skipping the shower, which was odd for this guy who never had a hair out of place. Winston's wife and his father both noticed that Winston's off. Something's off.
Yeah.
He stopped sleeping, and he started going on late-night drives when he was restless. That's called foreshadowing.
Yeah. Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Here we go.
By 1964, Kitty was working at the Eve's 11th Hour bar where she'd made tons of friends. She would sometimes take Mary Ann home with her on the weekend to Connecticut for a home-cooked Italian dinner.
Okay.
Is there anything better?
No.
If you had like an Italian grandma or an Italian mom making like real Italian food, there's nothing better.
Well, it's probably a good thing that I'm Welsh German, because if I was Italian, I'd probably weigh 900 pounds.
Rob does like shepherd's pie, but
I do, but I love pasta. Love pasta.
let me tell you, my sister lived in Italy for 3 years. I got to go over and visit. It's the best thing ever.
Oh, yeah.
The food there is just amazing.
Yep.
It's my favorite.
Yep.
But she would take Mary Ann home for this Italian dinner. If I was Mary Ann, I'd be going too. But it could get awkward at the dinner table because her family would always ask her if she was seeing anybody or are you dating? And she was. She was in love with Mary Ann.
Right.
But she didn't tell her family. She didn't tell her family that she was gay.
Right.
Now, Mary Ann and Kitty spent tons of time in the West Village in New York City. They liked the block between Bleecker and 3rd Street, and there were illegal village nightclubs there that catered more or less to gay people. Because at that time, under New York law, serving a single drink to a homosexual made a club or a restaurant a, quote, disorderly house, end quote.
Really?
By definition.
Wow.
And they were subject to a fine or the loss of their liquor license. I am not even kidding you.
Wow.
2 women dancing or 2 men kissing or anybody cross-dressing constituted disorderly conduct. And most of the clubs were owned and operated by the mob in New York City. Which totally makes sense because they were already paying off the police to mind their business.
Yep.
But there were vice raids at these places. There were still vice raids at these places.
Okay.
But that's where they're hanging out.
Right.
So Kitty's finding her way in the world in 1964. She's in love with Mary Ann. She's working these long hours at the bar, but she didn't complain. It wasn't her nature, and everybody loved seeing her at the bar. She's also making a lot of money. She was taking home about $750 a month, which in today's money is about $7,000.
Wow.
Yeah. And
This is 63?
This is 1964.
Had no idea.
Yeah, she's making about $7,000 a month.
Wow.
And when her dad started asking her when she was going to get married, she told him that she didn't need a man. And she made more than most of the men she knew.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she does tell him, I'm saving this money for a down payment on an Italian restaurant that I want to open. That's her dream.
Okay.
And because she has the last name Genovese or Genovese, which is the crime family in New York City. People would ask her what she was going to call her restaurant. Was she going to call it Kitty's or La Gattina, which is kitty in Italian? I thought that was very cute.
Yeah.
Thursday, March 12th, 1964, Kitty opens the bar that morning. She would bartend starting at 8 a.m.
Wow.
8 in the morning.
It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
Oh, my gosh. But by 6 p.m., she would be in the back of the house doing bookkeeping and managerial stuff for the bar. And on busy nights, she would work double shifts, and she'd forego her duties in the back office to help serve drinks and keep everybody happy. Okay. She really was like the life of the party while she's working there.
Yeah,
she's not drinking, but everybody adores her.
Yeah, everybody loved her.
Now, Eve's 11th hour bar would start to empty out around midnight, but the owner liked Kitty to keep the place open until around 3 a.m.
Okay.
And on this particular night, Kitty took her break and went to dinner with one of the regulars of the bar, nothing romantic, just friends. When she came back to the bar, she closed up and said goodnight, walking out into the cold March air. It was only 34 degrees in New York City on that night.
Right.
She got into her red convertible Fiat to drive home. It's 3 a.m.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Winston Moseley has sent his wife off to work the night shift at a Queens hospital. Winston's watching TV and drinking beer, and at around 1:30 a.m., Winston arms himself and gets into his white Chevy Corvair and drives through Jamaica and Hillside, both areas in Queens.
Okay.
He left his children at home alone, something he would do, but he felt like because the dogs were outside around the house and Wolfie was inside the house, that these kids were protected.
Okay.
He circled back toward Ozone Park where he lived, and he just kept on driving and looking. He's hunting. At 3 a.m., he finds himself in Hollis, Queens, driving east on Jamaica Avenue. This is when he sees a petite, dark-haired girl getting into a red Fiat. Winston followed the red Fiat to the Long Island Railroad station. She pulls her car into the parking lot. It's Kitty. She's parking her car just down the street from her apartment building. Now, Winston kept on driving, and he parked a half a block away. He puts a stocking hat on his head and gets out of the car and hurries toward the Long Island Railroad parking lot. Winston watches Kitty lock up her car and turns toward her building, which is just 15 yards or about 100 paces away. The door that led to her apartment on the second floor was in the back of the building, facing the railroad tracks.
Okay.
Now, there was a known police emergency call box on a telephone pole down the street at the corner of Austin and Lefferts Boulevard. At 3:19 a.m. on March 13th, 1964, Kitty heard footsteps behind her. She picked up the pace, but it was too late. Kitty's tackled in front of the neighborhood bookstore under a streetlight. Winston stabs Kitty in the back twice, and she let out a blood-curdling scream twice. It was one of those screams that...
Sheer terror.
Yes, sheer terror.
Yeah.
And she said, "Oh God, I've been stabbed." Now, Joseph Fink was an assistant superintendent at the building across the street from where the attack is happening. He's standing in the lobby of the building, and he had a clear view of the attack and the stabbing. And he thought about, quote, going downstairs to get my baseball bat, end quote. But instead, when he got downstairs, he took a nap in his apartment.
What?
He went to bed. I'm not even kidding you.
Gee whiz.
This is going to frustrate you from start to finish. I promise you.
Okay.
Now, other neighbors heard the screams, or they heard something as well. Also across the street, a man named Robert Moser heard Kitty's screams from his apartment. He looks out the 7th floor window where he lives and sees a man and a woman in an altercation. He couldn't see exactly what was going on, so he yelled, quote, "Leave that girl alone," end quote.
Okay.
Irene Frost in apartment 204 heard a shriek and got out of bed. She wanted to see what was going on, so she looks out the window. She sees a man and a woman standing across the street by the bookstore, and she watched for a minute, saying that nothing happened. So she went back to bed. The second time Kitty screamed, Irene got up again, and she sees Kitty on her knees on the sidewalk, and Winston is running up the street.
Wow.
Andrea Pick, who lived in apartment 403, heard the voices, and she also hears Robert Moser yell for him to get away from Kitty.
Right.
And she sees Winston run away. Quote, the poor girl got up slowly and she screamed, help. And she walked slowly toward the drugstore and up towards the back street. I was still at the window, scared, kind of frozen. A few minutes after that, the man came back walking normally as if nothing had happened. I couldn't see anything, but I heard the last two screams, help, help.
Oh, man.
14-year-old Michael Hoffman, who lived in the same building as Mr. Moser, also heard the commotion. He looked out his window and told his dad, Samuel, what he saw. Samuel called the police, and after 3 or 4 minutes on hold, he reached a police dispatcher. And he told them, there's a woman, she got beat up, she's staggering around. And he gives them the location where they are, but the police did not respond to Samuel Hoffman's call.
Why not?
I'm telling you, you're going to be frustrated.
Wow. Okay.
Now, Robert Moser yelling out the window scares off Winston, and he runs away and back to his car, where he sits for a few minutes. And Kitty struggles to her feet. She's bleeding profusely. Mm-hmm. She tries to get to the back door of her apartment building. She gets into the vestibule, where she collapses at the bottom of the stairs. But again, she cries out, help, help. Now, from many of the people who lived in the apartment, from their vantage point, it wasn't obvious that she was wounded. And others who looked didn't see her at all because Kitty walked around a corner trying to make her way home because she lived at 8270 Austin Street, and the door where she walked into her apartment didn't face the street. It faced the railroad tracks.
Right.
Now, at this point, Winston realizes he's been sitting in his car. There aren't any cops on the way. Yeah. This guy who yelled out the window hasn't called the cops.
Right.
Nobody showed up. So he gets out of the car, and this time, instead of wearing a stocking cap on his head, he's wearing a fedora. And he starts looking for Kitty.
Jeez.
And he finds her in the vestibule at the bottom of the stairs of the back door of her apartment building. Now, Carl Ross, man who lived in her building, he's an alcoholic dog groomer. I know that sounds weird, but that's what he is. He's an alcoholic and a dog groomer, and he lives in their building. He hears this commotion. He's very close to this vestibule. The screaming for help at 3:30 a.m. He hears all of it. And this guy's a little skittish by nature anyway. But Carl just waited for the screams to stop. But then he heard something closer to home. It was a muffled cry right outside his door, and he didn't open the door. He stands behind it, and he finally cracks the door, and he sees Kitty lying on her back trying to speak. On top of her is Winston Moseley.
Oh, man.
He will stab her repeatedly, again and again and again, and then he will rape her. Carl and Winston will look directly at each other when Carl opens this door. And then Carl just closes the door and walks away. Now, instead of calling the police, he's got a phone in his apartment. Instead of calling the police, Carl Ross calls other neighbors for advice on what to do, including, I guess, his girlfriend. But when he gets to Sophia Farrar, she tells her husband, call the police.
Yeah.
And Sophie rushes out the door, not knowing if Kitty's assailant is still there or not.
Good for her.
She didn't care.
Yeah.
She was coming to the aid of her friend and her morning coffee buddy, Kitty.
Yeah.
She didn't care. She was out the door. I've seen an interview with her son, and he was like, I was scared to death. My dad was like, hold up, you can't go by yourself. And she was out the door and gone.
Wow.
When Winston has repeatedly stabbed Kitty and raped her, he leaves her still alive, covered in blood at the bottom of the stairs. And when Sophie gets to Kitty, she's choking on her own blood. Sophie cradles her in her arms and tells her that help is coming. Hang on, help is coming.
Wow.
At 3:55 a.m., the police are finally called. That's when the police are finally called, at 3:55 a.m.
Wow.
But it would be too late to save Kitty's life. The police and ambulance arrive at 4:10 a.m. This is an hour after she's been stabbed for the first time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kitty would die on the way to the hospital in Queens. Now, Kitty's girlfriend, Marianne, is none the wiser until the police knock on her door after they've already taken Kitty away by ambulance. And one of the police officers that crowded into their little small apartment actually tells Marianne that Kitty has died on the way to the hospital. She's DOA.
Wow.
Now, Detective Mitchell Sang was on the scene a little before 7 a.m. He reported that Marianne was very shy and withdrawn, while Carl Ross, who was drinking out of a bottle of vodka, was trying to console her. But according to Detective Sang, Carl was just being obnoxious. And he's so obnoxious, he's arrested for disorderly conduct and taken away.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. The Queens homicide detectives John Carroll and Jerry Burns take over, and they start questioning everybody.
Right.
And they really questioned Marianne. They'd spoken to enough people in the building to know that Marianne and Kitty were lovers, and the police asked all kinds of inappropriate questions until Marianne finally said, yes, we're lesbians.
Yeah.
She was just like, is that what you wanted to hear?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Later, the police will say their only motive in doing this was that jealousy was always a motive for murder, and she was the significant other.
Oh, man.
I don't know.
Even though this guy that cracked the door open
sees another guy.
Yeah.
Right?
Looked him
Yeah.
right in the... Yeah, okay.
But he's an unreliable witness because he's, tipping the bottle all the time. He's
Okay.
drinking vodka out of a bottle while he's talking to the police.
Jeez.
When Kitty's autopsy is performed, they find that she has been stabbed 13 times in
Jeez.
various parts of her body.
Wow.
She had defensive wounds on her hands. She'd bled profusely, but her cause of death was actually bilateral pneumothorax. Air escaping from Kitty's punctured lungs filled her chest cavity, compressing her lungs. So she suffocated while she was still trying to speak.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
What a horrible way to go.
Yeah. And Sophie Farrar, as she's holding her, one of the things that she talks about in this one documentary is that she could see her little hands. She was wearing black leather gloves.
Yeah.
And there were cut slits in the gloves from her defensive wounds, and her hands were bleeding through those gloves. Yeah. Now, there were plenty of homicides in New York City in 1964, so many that Kitty's death was just like a blip in the newspaper. Then 5 days after Kitty's murder, when the police had no suspects and no leads, on the afternoon of March 18th, Raoul clearly saw a thin African-American man carrying a TV set out of a neighbor's house. So Raoul asks him, "What are you doing in the Bannister's house?" And the man says, quote, "It's okay, I'm helping them move," end quote. Raoul watches this guy put the TV set into his white Chevy Corvair and then walk right back into the Bannister's house like he owns the place. He's whistling as he's walking back into this house. So Raoul calls a neighbor and says, "Hey, are the Bannisters moving or something?" And the neighbor says, "Absolutely not. I am calling the police."
Yeah. Okay.
Then Raoul goes out to the white Corvair. He opens the hood and pulls off the distributor cap.
Oh, man.
And then he slams the hood shut and walked back into his apartment, and he's just going to watch the rest of it unfold.
Good for him.
So while one neighbor's calling the police, the other one is dismantling the car.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Now, when the thief gets back to his car and it won't start, when Winston gets back and his car doesn't start, he just sort of saunters down the street like he doesn't have a care in the world.
Wow.
And a patrol car actually pulls up beside him, and they're like, "What are you up to? What are you doing?"
Yeah.
And they stop and they frisk him, and they find a screwdriver on him. Then they walk him up to his car, they open the trunk, and they find the Bannister's television set, as well as another TV and some small appliances. Also in the car are pornographic photos of nude males and females in obscene, indecent, and filthy poses.
Wow.
That was a quote.
Okay.
Should have said quote. And 40 magazines of nude women.
Okay.
And the officers ask his name, and he says, "I'm Winston Moseley."
So you just, okay, didn't even try to do
Didn't
that.
even try.
Yeah.
Nope.
Okay.
They take him into the 114th precinct, and he's interviewed, where he sits with his hands in his lap, cool as a cucumber. And the detective who interviews him can't make the connection with this mild-mannered man in front of him, who he knows owns his own house, has a great steady job, he's a great father, no arrest record, to this man that they caught burglarizing a home. It just didn't track, you know?
Yeah.
He doesn't have a record. He has a very steady job. He makes great money. And yet he's out stealing television sets.
Yeah. Makes no sense.
It doesn't make any sense. So the detective asks him, quote, "What's your story, Moseley?" And Winston, very calmly and in a monotone voice, tells him that he did indeed steal the TVs and appliances. He tells him that he's pulled off dozens of similar jobs in the past year, and he usually pulled all of these jobs between midnight and sunup.
Really?
Yes.
He just confessed everything.
Gave it up.
Wow.
Hang on.
Okay.
Then he would give the TVs to his father because his dad had a repair shop in Corona. And the dirty pictures, well, Winston had an explanation. He said that the porn was part of his haul from an earlier burglary.
Okay.
Quote, "I never buy that stuff myself," end quote.
But I did pick this one up.
It's not mine. It's not mine.
Nice try, Winston.
The porn's not mine.
Yeah.
They drive to Alfonso's, Winston's dad,
Right.
his TV repair place, and they arrest him as well for receiving stolen property.
Sure. Yeah.
He, too, is very calm. But the detective who's interviewing Winston thinks there's more to this guy. Detective Tartaglia thinks Winston isn't telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Yeah,
so help
exactly.
me God.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that afternoon, they have another come to Jesus meeting with Winston. The detective wanted to talk about other things that had been going on in the area that he knocked around in,
Right.
namely Queens,
Okay.
things that were unsolved.
Mm-hmm.
And he started with the murder of Kitty Genovese.
Ah.
Now, someone from the apartment building had remembered seeing a white Chevy Corvair the night she's murdered, the night Kitty is murdered.
Okay.
And what did Winston drive?
A white Chevy Corvair.
A white Chevy Corvair.
Yeah.
And when the officer asks him, "What do you think about that?" Winston didn't say anything. And Detective Tartaglia could have let it all go because there was no signs that Winston was a murderer.
Right.
Remember, he didn't have a record.
Right.
You know, he's just a petty thief.
Right.
And Winston's a first-time offender, but Detective Tartaglia saw something, quote, "creepy" in his expressionless calm, end quote. He thinks it's hinky.
Yeah.
So Detective John Carroll of Queens Homicide and Detective Mitch Sang, who were at Kitty's murder investigation, they joined the interrogation. Come on in. Let's ask him some more questions.
Some hard-hitting questions.
Now, none of them inform Winston of his rights, which will later become an issue.
Wow.
But they chat with him for a few minutes, and then Detective Carroll reached for Winston's hands, and they held them up to fluorescent light and saw that there were small scabs on 2 of Winston's fingers.
Okay.
And Winston tells him that he scratched them working around the house.
Okay.
But the police weren't buying it, and they actually say to him, quote, "No, you got those cuts from Kitty Genovese when you were putting the knife in," end quote.
Wow. Nothing like being direct to the point.
Yeah, I mean, they're just coming at him. And Winston says, after looking around the room and smiling just a little bit, quote, "Okay, I killed her," end quote.
Wow. So he gave it up?
Yeah,
Wow.
he gave it up. He gave it up.
Kind of reminds me of Legally Blonde at the end when she's being the attorney and she...
Got the daughter on the stand
Yeah.
who got the perm.
Yeah, exactly.
And,
And then
she
she's-
starts interrogating her. Wouldn't somebody who's had 5 perms know this?
Yeah, and she goes,
You can't get it wet?
"I thought it was you."
I didn't want to kill him. I thought it was you.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. This isn't that dramatic. I mean, if you can believe it or not.
Yeah, that was a little more, that was movie dramatic. This is
Yeah.
like real life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He just says, "Okay, I killed her."
I did it. Wow. Amazing.
He tells the detectives how he went for a drive on the night of March 12th with a serrated hunting knife in his coat pocket. How he spotted Kitty getting into her Fiat on Jamaica Avenue in Hollis and followed her to Kew Gardens, where he jumped her, killed her, and made his escape.
Wow.
They start pressing him for details that only the killer would know. And what he tells them is, quote, "She was wearing a sanitary pad," end quote. And the medical examiner had already said that Kitty was menstruating, but nobody else knew that.
Jeez.
They questioned him for 8 hours until Winston asked for dinner. And after the food arrived, it was like burgers and fries. And I didn't put that into, to the script. But yeah, he asked for food and it shows up and he starts eating and then he just keeps talking. He had taken a brown billfold, something that wasn't found on Kitty, but it was something that Marianne had told the police that Kitty owned because she had given it to her for Christmas.
Okay.
And Winston tells police that he took the $49 out of the billfold and tossed it in the weeds by the Ray Graham parking lot where he went to work the next morning, like nothing had ever happened.
Are they going to go look for it?
Police go and look, and there it is.
Yeah.
Then he tells police that the night he murdered Kitty, quote, I went out that night intending to kill a woman, end quote.
Jeez.
As she ran away from him, he plunged the knife into her back twice, and she fell down. He tells them that he left after he heard the voice call out, but when police didn't show up, he returned to the scene and found her in the doorway.
Wow.
Kitty started to scream again when she saw him, so he stabbed her in the throat. And he attempted to rape her, but he fled with her billfold containing $49, her keys, and her bra. Then he tells police that after he murdered Kitty, it was about 4 a.m, and he's heading home, he happens upon a car that's just idling at a green light because the driver in front of him had fallen asleep. So Winston puts his Corvair into park and he walks up to the car and he's got this blood-stained knife in his pocket and he taps on the window and he wakes this guy up. And the guy rolls down his window and Winston says, quote, you shouldn't be sleeping like that. The carbon monoxide builds up. Or someone could come along and do something bad to you, end quote.
Jeez.
And the guy behind the wheel who's been sleeping says, quote, you're right. You're a good fella, end quote.
Oh, man.
Now, can you imagine being that guy, finding out that you were that guy? Yeah.
Wow.
But Winston's not finished yet. Nope. He goes on to admit to even more burglaries, several rapes, and another murder.
Really?
Annie Mae Johnson. February 29th, 1964, Winston followed the 24-year-old to her home at 133rd Avenue in South Ozone Park. This is his neighborhood. In front of her home, he asks her for money, and when she hands it to him, he shot her 4 times in the stomach with a .22 rifle.
Wow. With a rifle?
With a rifle.
Good grief. Where was he hiding that?
I guess under his coat,
Jeez.
Long coat. It's cold out. There's snow on the ground.
Wow.
And while she's bleeding into the snow, she gives him the keys to her home and begs him to take her inside. And instead, he goes inside himself and steals $100 in cash and returns to her and fired into her back again with this gun. Quote, I didn't think she was dead, so I shot her again. I shot her 3 times more, end quote.
Jeez, what a monster.
He said that he, quote, turned her over and I could see she was dead. I decided to rape her, end quote. So he rolled her into the home and tried to rape her while her family members are upstairs asleep and unaware that anything is going on downstairs.
Wow, what a twisted, yeah.
And when he can't rape her because he can't perform, he sets fire to her naked body on the living room floor. Yeah.
Jiminy.
He covered her body with wadded up newspaper and he put a scarf between her legs and he lit the scarf to make sure her crotch burned.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think these are sexually charged. I mean.
You think?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't read anything explicit about that, but I just think, yeah, his mental illness.
Yeah.
In order for police to know he's telling the truth, they exhume Annie Mae's body.
Okay.
Because the coroner's report said that she was killed with an ice pick.
Really?
But Winston stuck to his story that he shot her. And after they exhume her body, they x-ray it and see that there are 6 .22 caliber bullets in her stomach.
Who was this medical examiner that missed that?
Right? The coroner mistook the small caliber bullet holes as puncture marks.
Okay.
So Winston is telling the truth.
Yeah.
But Winston isn't finished with his confession. He also confesses to murdering Barbara Kralik, a 15-year-old girl that police knew her killer was a guy named Alvin the Monster Mitchell. And now the police have 2 men confessing to the same murder, which doesn't look good for them.
Right.
And it's leaked to the Daily News that the police are baffled by which murderer killed Barbara Kralik. But the police are thinking, is he confessing to all these crimes that he didn't commit so he can get an insanity plea? Or what is his real motive here? Or is he just coming clean?
Sure.
But here's where it gets really interesting. New York City Police Commissioner Michael Murphy has lunch with Abe Rosenthal, the editor at the New York Times. It's not until the end of their lunch that Abe asks his buddy, Michael, about the murder, saying, how about that double confession out in Queens? What's that all about? End quote.
Right.
And Commissioner Murphy says, quote, brother, that Queens story is one for the books. 38 witnesses, end quote.
Wow.
He's talking about Kitty's murder.
Right.
And when Abe is astonished at the number 38, the commissioner repeats himself. Quote, I've been in this business a long time, but this beats everything, end quote.
Wow.
Now, these 2 meetings between the 2 friends were supposed to be off the record, but Abe asks if he can assign a reporter to the story, and would Murphy cooperate?
Okay.
That same afternoon, editor Abe Rosenthal met with reporter Martin Gansberg. Now, Kitty's murder had been reported in all the other papers, including the Times, but it was considered a run-of-the-mill homicide story. And I read that most of those were buried in the newspapers at that time.
Okay.
Now, Rosenthal is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, now editor of the Times, who demanded the who, what, when, where, and why in his journalist stories. But he also wanted emotional stories that engaged the reader.
Right.
He sends Martin Gansberg to Kew Gardens to get the story, the real story. And Gansberg spent 3 days interviewing witnesses, neighbors, and police officers.
Okay.
The New York Times gave this story 4 columns on the front page.
Wow.
That's a lot of real estate in the New York Times.
Oh, yeah.
This story comes out on March 27th, 1964, just 2 weeks after the crime. And the opening line was, quote, for more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens.
Wow.
End quote.
Wow, just amazing.
I know. Continuing that quote, twice their chatter and the sudden glow of their bedroom lights interrupted him and frightened him off. Each time he returned, sought her out, and stabbed her again. Not one person telephoned the police during the assault. One witness called after the woman was dead, end quote. Now, the original headline was 37 people who saw the murder and didn't call the police. Then in the first line, they changed it to 38. The story was corrected to be 38 in the headline, and even more than that has been corrected over the years. This article will be cited over and over by media outlets, social psychology textbooks, and academic studies. Now, because of this time story, Kitty Genovese became a catchphrase in psychology. It's also called the bystander effect, and unofficially known as the Kitty Genovese syndrome, where bystanders ignore tragedies that are unfolding right in front of their eyes and why they don't intervene.
Wow.
In fact, it's after this story runs and the public outrage hits a boiling point that 911 came into use.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Ah.
I mean, interestingly enough, that was one of the cases that really prompted 911.
That's amazing. Wow.
They wanted one universal emergency number for calling police, fire, and ambulance.
Sure.
And some states even passed Good Samaritan laws that guaranteed legal protection if you're a bystander that comes to the aid of somebody in distress. The problem is the New York Times story wasn't accurate. Sure, Joseph Fink and Carl Ross made it a point not to get involved, but the others in the building either called the police, shouted out the window, thought it was a lover's quarrel when she walked away on her own, or actually came to her aid and cradled her in their arms as she lay dying.
Right.
No one is certain where the number 38 came from, except years later, Kitty's brother, William, his name is Bill, will research this murder, the whole case, and the witnesses and the killer. And what he finds from the police reports was that at the time, the police interviewed 38 people. So those are their 38 people who ignored everything.
Gotcha.
But there were never 38 people watching from their window and eating popcorn and watching it unfold.
They were looking for, well, the equivalent of clicks.
Yeah, and if you live in the city, there's always sirens. There's always somebody yelling or somebody playing the bongos on the rooftop next door to you. Yeah. It's a city. They call it the city that never sleeps for a reason.
Exactly.
It's loud.
Right.
Now, according to the Times, as Kitty screamed, quote, please help me, end quote, lights came on in nearby apartment buildings, faces appeared in windows, a man shouted, but nothing more, end quote.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, geez.
For 35 minutes, 38 people simply watched as Moseley slaughtered their pretty young neighbor.
Wow.
Now, one witness explained himself with a phrase that became infamous, quote, I didn't want to get involved, end quote. That was the guy who was going to go get his bat,
right, and
but
then
instead went to bed. Yeah. Now, the news of this murder traveled around the world, that this murder happened, and people in the United States, particularly New York, just watched it unfold. Plus, the New York Times did the story, so it had to be credible.
Right.
New York was kind of already thought of as not a safe place.
Right.
But now New York was thought of as the worst place ever. How could people be so horrible? And it became internationally infamous as a city filled with thoughtless people who didn't care about one another, where people could watch their neighbors get stabbed on the street without lifting a finger to help them, leaving them to die in a pool of their own blood instead of helping.
Wow.
The moral decay of our society and our country was out on display. It would be talked about again and again and again and dissected over and over and over.
Because of a newspaper article.
Yes. Yeah. But was it true? Had no one helped Kitty? And were they even aware of what was happening outside? Because remember, the woman who loved her, Mary Ann, is asleep in the apartment building and hears nothing.
Yeah, it's 3 a.m. or something like that, 4 a.m.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kitty was first stabbed on Austin Street, but after the initial attack, which lasted no more than a minute or two, she staggered to a narrow foyer at the back of her building. She's across the street and facing only the tracks of the Long Island Railroad.
Right.
And it was inside this foyer that Moseley discovered her after leaving the scene and coming back. And it was here, out of view and earshot of nearly everyone in Kew Gardens, that the greater part of the assault occurred.
Right.
Now, the Times initially described 3 attacks based on a faulty police report. In fact, there were only the 2, the one on Austin Street and the other in the foyer. The Times later noted the discrepancy, but to this day, 3 is the number that is generally cited in histories, which just makes people think that there was even more on the occasion that night to watch, that they were really watching Kitty suffer this horrible death.
Yeah.
The true number of eyewitnesses was not 38, but 6 or 7.
Okay.
And far more residents actually heard something and didn't see anything. And many of the witnesses have said that if they understood what was happening, they would have done something, but they thought it was a lover's quarrel or an argument spilling out of this Old Bailey bar on Austin Street. Yeah. And the Times insinuated that these type of excuses were disingenuous. It's not a lack of caring that keeps people from showing up to help in emergencies. And psychologists say it's confusion, fear, misapprehension, uncertainty. The problem is, lost in all of this is the victim, Kitty Genovese.
Right.
They've made such a big deal out of the people not coming to her aid, which wasn't true, that her death is sort of lost in the whole thing.
Yeah. She becomes like the byline.
Exactly. At trial, Winston testified describing the murder in detail. There was no question he was Kitty's killer. At first, he was given a death sentence. He appealed because he said he should have been offered the opportunity to claim that he was mentally insane. His death sentence was changed to life in prison on June 1st, 1967. In 1968, during a trip to Buffalo, New York Hospital for surgery, which was happening because Winston had put a soup can in his own rectum.
Oh,
so they had to leave prison to have that removed.
What is wrong with this? Well, never mind.
There's so much wrong.
Yeah.
Winston overpowered a guard and beat him up to the point that his eyes were bloody. Then he took a bat and swung it at the closest person to him and took 5 hostages, raping one of them before he was recaptured after a 2-day manhunt in Buffalo.
Wow.
Yeah. He also participated in the later Attica prison riots.
Okay.
In 1977, Winston obtained a BA in sociology by correspondence. He even published an op-ed in what newspaper you think?
No, the
New York
Times.
Times in April of 1977. It was all about prisoner rehabilitation. He claimed he too had been rehabilitated. Quote, "The man who killed Kitty Genovese in 1964 is no more,"
Sure.
end quote.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah. He concluded, quote, "Today I am a man who wants to be an asset to society, not a liability to it," end quote. Well, I bet all that time in jail gave you a lot of time to think about it.
Yeah, you're a little late, dude. A little late to the party.
Yeah. Moseley was denied parole a 13th time on March 11th, 2008. A previous parole hearing included his defense that, quote, "For a victim outside, it's one time or 1 hour or a 1-minute affair. But for the person who's caught, it's forever," end quote.
Oh.
Yeah, that's prison, Winston.
Yeah. Like,
You kill somebody in a minute, you spend your life in jail.
what's your point, Winston?
Yeah.
Jeez.
I mean, when I read that quote, I was like, is he kidding right now?
Wow.
Ugh.
Say something like that and you're going to be assured that your parole is going to be denied.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah.
What an idiot.
Winston Moseley would die in prison on March 28th, 2016, in the Clinton Correctional Facility after serving 52 years.
Yeah, good.
He was one of the longest serving inmates in the New York system.
Good.
Now, a year after the first Times story was printed in 1964, Abe Rosenthal, the editor, wrote and released a book, 38 Witnesses. Yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
If I just kind of feel like if there's money to be made,
Yeah.
I'm going to write it.
Yeah.
In 2004, the New York Times wrote a piece basically debunking the first story that was written in 1964. They had to, because by that time, other papers had written pieces about it being false.
Yeah.
So to get it right, the media should have told the story of the people who tried to help and of the complex circumstances. That it wasn't a lack of compassion, it was a lack of information that basically prevented other people from coming to her aid.
Yeah.
Yeah, they weren't just standing by watching.
Right.
Now, I want to tell you about a documentary called The Witness, The True Story of Kitty Genovese. And I'll give you a link to it in the show notes. I watched it. I got to the very end and I cried. I mean, it gets me in the feels just talking about it. But Kitty's brother, Bill, does a very deep dive into the people around Kitty and what they saw and what they heard and what they remembered about her and that night. It is extremely moving. At the end of the documentary, he hires an actress to stand where Kitty stood and to scream the same words that Kitty screamed. It's really something. It's gut-wrenching.
How sad.
It's very sad. And my hat is off to him. I mean, the whole documentary is really remarkable.
Yeah.
And he focuses where the story is, which is his sister,
Right.
Kitty. So I highly recommend you go watch this documentary. But that is the story of Kitty Genovese, and that's all I have to say about that. Hey, Hitched to Homicide listeners. Have you read any good books lately? Or have you listened to any good books? All of the Sex and Lies series books, as well as the Jane Doe series, are available on Audible and iTunes. Hotter than hell in half of Alabama, the Sex and Lies series begins with Sex, Lies, and Sweet Tea. There are 9 books to listen to in that series alone. Left as a newborn to die in a dumpster, she has no name. Tossed from foster home to foster home, she has no family. With no known past, she's deemed a perfect fit for a task force Washington denies exists. A selective assassin for the United States government, Jane Doe tracks down known terrorists on domestic soil. The Jane Doe books have been called a bit military, a bit assassin, and a bit genius. Start the new year by listening to a good book by me, Chris Calvert, on Audible or iTunes. Or if you like to read, go to chriscalvert.com and download some free books. And thanks for being a listener of Hitched to Homicide.
Wow, what a story. I mean, this guy was just twisted.
He's horrible, and I didn't really even go into the other victims at all because I really wanted to focus on Kitty.
Right.
But the story is very remarkable.
Yeah.
It's incredibly remarkable, and so many of the people have died that lived in that building because a lot of them were older people,
Right.
and so by now, or by the time he started working on his documentary, these people had passed away. But some of them hadn't. And Sophie Farrar was alive at the time he did the documentary. And it was really something for Kitty's brother to meet Sophie and for her to talk to him about her last moments.
Wow.
It was very poignant, very moving.
Well,
I need something funny.
Let's lighten it up just a little bit.
Please. I want to bless somebody's heart.
We're going to lighten it up with a little bless your heart.
Well, bless your heart.
All right. I've got 4 of them.
That's the magic number.
Yeah, it seems to be the sweet spot. All right. So the first one I'm calling, well, it ain't shrimp and grits, but okay.
I love shrimp.
I know. Albert Jackson Doughty could have easily been a character from the Home Alone films, and that's not an overstatement. Doughty tried to break into a home by smashing a glass door with a paint can.
Oh.
Unfortunately for him, the can bounced off and broke open. Doughty eventually got inside, but all he collected was a can of tuna fish and a box of oatmeal.
Oh, my gosh.
On the way out, however, the man stepped in the spilled paint. Officers followed the paint footprints to a nearby motel and arrested him while he was enjoying his lunch of tuna fish and oatmeal.
Bless his heart. He didn't think to take off his shoes.
Oh, all right. Second one. They didn't teach us that in driver's ed.
Oh, no.
When you're trying to steal a car, there's one requirement that's needed: an ability to drive.
Are you talking to me? Did you pick this story for a reason,
Nah,
honey?
you're a good driver. You're a good driver.
I have this on tape now. This is great. This is great. I'm sorry. Keep going.
One young thief didn't know about that unwritten rule.
Oh, so what's the unwritten rule?
Well, this teenager tried to steal a car from a woman in Omaha, Nebraska. Unfortunately for him, the car was a manual, and the little fella couldn't even start it. I mean, he just had no idea. After trying desperately for 7 minutes to start the car, the police showed up and arrested him.
Oh, my gosh.
Oops, bummer, dude.
I can drive a stick shift.
Yeah.
Not very well. It makes strange noises.
Yeah.
I grind the gears, but I could do it in a pinch.
Yeah,
if
all of
I
my
had
first
to.
cars were stick shift. So anyway, okay, number 3.
Fine.
We thought this would actually work. Using a wheelchair to escape a crime scene isn't the best solution for criminals. However, a Texan duo thought it might be worth a try. Nomi Duchesne, I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm not sure, attempted a knife-point robbery at a jewelry shop while the accomplice, Luis del Castillo, waited outside with a getaway vehicle, a wheelchair.
Oh, that's what I was about to say. The getaway. Was it a motorized wheelchair?
No.
Oh, my gosh.
Duchesne, who lived near the shop, was tackled by a customer before she and her friend departed in what might have been the slowest escape in history. And number 4, and finally, no deposit, no return.
Okay.
Police in Delaware say a man who robbed a Wilmington bank on Saturday didn't keep the cash for long. After fleeing the Wells Fargo branch, he paused to make a deposit in the ATM outside.
Oh.
Police say McRoberts Williams, a 44-year-old California resident, handed a note to the teller Saturday morning saying a robbery was taking place, WBZ reports. The 25-year-old woman gave him an undisclosed amount of cash. Williams fled on foot and made the deposit in a machine on the exterior of the building, Delaware State Police said.
Oh.
Officers responding to the scene found him behind a nearby shopping center and took him into custody without incident. He was charged with second-degree robbery, a felony, with the bond set at $6,000.
Did he make bond because he had the cash from the bank?
Yeah, he withdrew out of his ATM.
Out of his ATM account? Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, bless
his
their
heart. That's a big bless his heart. Oh, my gosh.
Can you imagine going, hand the letter to the teller, get the cash, and then just go outside and start putting money
Yeah,
in?
no.
Whatever.
No. Well, that's why we're doing a bless your heart for him.
Yeah.
Well, if you have a bless your heart, or you know someone who would rob a bank and then go out to the ATM
Jeez.
and their heart needs blessing,
Yeah, it definitely needs blessing.
go to hitchedtohomicide.com. There's a pull-down menu. While you're there, you can also suggest a case.
Yes.
That's all we have today. That's my amazing husband out there.
And that's my beautiful bride in the booth.
Join us next time on Hitched to Homicide.
Bye, y'all.